Spacey shark, do 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 do. Spacey shark, do 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 do. Spacey shark, do 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 do. Spacey shark. Hello, YouTube. I'm gonna get so much hate for that intro, aren't I? What was I thinking? Oh no. Anyway, welcome to this week's video, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in again. We're talking about Indomitus this week. Indomitus hot on everybody's lips at the moment. There's been a lot of conversation around it, and I'm starting to now think about planning for it. Starting to think about what I might want to do with those minis. So I'm listening to viewer requests, and I'm kind of parsing data and figuring out where I want to go with it. And one particular listener request last week caught my eye. I was really interested in a comment that I got about Charcarodons Astra, the space sharks. A chapter that actually, back in the Rogue Trader days, back in the early days of the game, I was quite familiar with, but I hadn't really seen them come up since. And it turns out what I actually hadn't realised was that the low Gothic name Space Sharks had been converted and is now referred to in the high Gothic name Charcarodons Astra. So the reason I've not heard from this chapter in ages is because they were using high Gothic instead of low Gothic, and so it just never kind of clicked to me. Chapter I used to really enjoy. I think they have a really cool colour scheme. Neutral colours for Space Marines I think are super cool because it allows you to just do nice things with colour accenting and stuff like that. So I wanted to come up with how I would do a Primaris Space Shark scheme. Thinking about maybe if you wanted to paint that Indomitus box set all up as Space Sharks, what would be a good way to come up with a scheme that you could execute across the whole box, would still look nice. So what we're going to do is something that is fairly replicable in a large batch, but at the same time is not, it's not too hard to start adding extra bits to them. We're going to actually add some of those little extra bits as well, just to make it a bit posher. So you'll be able to judge for yourself sort of how far in you'd want to go. But this week we are going to look at the Space Sharks. Let's get to it. Okay, we'll be kicking off proceedings today with Stormvermin Fur and Celestra Grey through the airbrush. You've probably seen me do this a few times by now. When I do Space Marines, I really like working up the base armour colour with an airbrush. It's just super quick, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it with a brush. It's just going to be a bit slower if you want those nice smooth transitions. So I do recommend using an airbrush for this, starting off with a Stormvermin Fur and just picking out anything that sort of looks like it should catch a fair chunk of light, really. Go fairly ham with it, cover the majority of the miniature in Stormvermin Fur. Then switch over to your Celestra and just sort of pick out your lighter parts with your Celestra. You know, try to avoid undersides of things and insides of things, areas that wouldn't really be able to get any light. Let's finish that off now. Nice big old squirt on the helmet and the top of the backpack there. Those are always the areas you want super bright. There we go. Now I wanted to do a fair bit of these next steps with Black Templar contrast. I wanted to do the soft joints in the armour, but I also initially started out thinking, oh, I'll do the shoulder pads with it, and I'll do the chest eagle with it, which was going to get painted gold anyway. And actually remembered I don't really love this paint. I was pretty happy with how the soft joints turned out using it, but everything else that I painted in it I ended up going over, so I'm just really showing the soft joints here. I'm not going to bother showing the rest of the stuff, so it all ended up getting hit over with something else. And next up, it's the Doomy Oil Wash. Please don't be scared of it, I promise you it's not that bad. Just these two oil paints, burnt sienna and ivory black, mixed with some spirit, white spirit, mineral spirit, whatever it's called where you live. Thin it to a sort of washy consistency, you know, get the colour right. You can see me here just fiddling around getting the colour right. And I initially started off wanting to use that clever capillary action of oil washes and just drop it into the recesses. But I was a bit overzealous and I got a bit of surface staining. Which wouldn't have been a problem, I could have cleaned that up, no issue. But I looked at it and I was like, do you know what? That slight brown tint over this grey actually looks really bloody pretty. So I decided actually to end up doing an all-over oil wash, not just a panel shade. And just that brown tint that it gives to the grey, I thought was super cool. I really, really liked it. I'm just hair drying it now. And then I'll go in and just make a couple of little corrections to it here and there. There was just a bit of tea staining on a couple of the surfaces, so I just wanted to kind of wipe that back a bit with some mineral spirit. And then into some solid black just to do some reblacking. I'm not going to bother showing this properly, really. I just reblacked the areas that needed to be reblacked. You know, the gun, the chest eagle, the shoulder pads, that kind of thing. All very straightforward. You don't really need to watch me do it for more than a couple of seconds. Then we're going to go into some Retributor armour. We're going to do the chest eagle, the shoulder pad trims with this, and I'm going to instantly regret painting things in this order, because what I'm going to do here is, first of all, I'm really struggling to keep this on camera because I'm doing the chest eagle, which is behind the gun, and because I'd already painted the gun black, inevitably I got gold on the gun and then had to go in and reblack the gun again. So in the end, I just said fuck it and chucked the gold on quickly. I figured, look, I'm going to have to reblack now anyway. So I just, instead of being neat with the gold, just lobbed it all on there and then came back with the black and tidied it all up with the black instead. It's kind of just the easier way to do it anyway. It's quicker and it ends up with the same effect. So, you know, doesn't really matter. There you go, just tidying up a few more bits of black there. Getting a bit in on the backpack. And then Bob's your mother's brother. Should be ready for the next step, which is my absolute favourite Vallejo metal colour airbrush, dark aluminium. Bloody beautiful. This paint has become such a staple in my painting because it's such a bright metallic that applies so evenly, so flatly, so quickly, one coat, but it also shades really nicely with Nuln oil. So like if you want a nice bright kind of blade steel, it looks really good. But if you want to just hammer it with a bunch of Nuln oil, it comes down to this really nice kind of dark battle-worn metal. It is the perfect silver metallic paint in my opinion. I recommend every painter have this in their arsenal. And again, just touring around and getting those bits of silver in. Bits on the backpack. I never tend to do the whole ball area of the backpack in metallic. I see a lot of people do that. I like to kind of do majority of the ball area in just a flat colour and just have a sort of vent area in metallic. It's just a preference thing. If you want to do the whole ball area in silver, feel free. I'm not going to call the painting police on you, I promise. Okay, so that's how our marine is looking with some metallics on him now. Starting to take shape, we're starting to get a bit of an idea of what we're going for. But next up, I want to start getting those metals shaded down now, just to get a bit of context. So Agrax Earthshade for the golds, Nuln oil for the blacks. You've seen a million people shade a million metallics with a million different Citadel shades before, so I'm just going to chuck it in very quickly, very simply, very straightforward. I tend to favour slightly overloading my brush when it comes to Agrax, just because it's a bit pale when you put it on thinly. It kind of needs that build up to do its job. You'll also notice I'm painting the entire surface of the shoulder pads with Agrax there. That's just because I do the same thing on the gun as well. Agrax has this sort of milky semi-sheen to it when it dries, and it kind of just creates a little bit of free artificial highlight for you, which normally I wouldn't maybe necessarily go for, but in this context, where we're sort of trying to do a mixture of battle ready and posh at the same time, it just kind of makes those shoulder pads look a bit nicer without needing to do any proper painting on them. So that's kind of the excuse there. Then we're going to shoot into some Mephiston red very quickly and just painting a Kneepad red. I'm going to do some freehand on it in a minute, so I just want to quickly block this Kneepad in with a couple of coats of Mephiston red. Very simple, very straightforward. my trusty Celestra Grey comes back out. This is where we're going to start to block that freehanding now. Now, I wanted this to basically look like a kind of shark's mouth on his Kneepad, and obviously shark have a million, billion, jillion teeth, and so it's just a case of painting a bunch of dags. I wanted them to look fairly consistent left to right, so I sort of started in the middle and worked outwards, but the shark's teeth are a mess. If you've ever seen a photograph of the shark's mouth, they need a dentist. So it's, you know, just paint a bunch of spikes basically, and then, you know, once I've got the sort of pointy part nice and neat, then I go in behind it and just infill the extra area that's left over above and below. Just like that. Trying very hard not to do a tonic impression. Just neaten up a little bit more. And when I do freehand like this, I like to introduce little bits of battle damage to it sometimes, so I'm not kind of super obsessive here over this being perfect, because I can kind of come in and chip away at it a bit. I also chucked a quick shade in here just with some really thin black paint, and then just came back to my Celestra again to sort of blend back out of that shade. Again, that's optional, but I think freehand always sits a little bit better to me if you put some stuff around it. Okay, next up we're going into more Celestra Grey now, no colour change, but we're going to start edge highlighting. My edge highlighting method is a bit different to what you might be used to seeing on, say, Warhammer TV or Heavy Metal, for example. I don't like to edge highlight every single edge. There's a couple of reasons for it. The first is that it's so unrealistic for me. I don't mind a bit of rule of cool, where things break away from realism a little in order to achieve an effect that looks cool. But for me, it's so unrealistic. No surface would ever catch light on every single one of its edges like that. And it just kind of does something to my suspension of disbelief. And when I look at a miniature that's been edge highlighted on every single edge like that, I really just don't like how it looks. So there's a personal preference element there. But also it's just obviously quite a lot more practical to only edge highlight the key edges, the ones that really notice, the ones that your attention is drawn to. It's much more practical to just hit those because it's going to take you a lot less time. So, you know, it's kind of a double-edged sword. There are reasons that are both personal and practical for why I don't edge highlight everything. But essentially, you know, I'm still doing what you're used to seeing, just a thin line on all of the edges that I want to edge highlight. And that's how he is after the first one. We're then going to grab Corax White, and I tell you now, when you start thinning this colour, it wants to dry instantly. So as this is our more refined edge highlight now, so we're really sort of trying to target corners and tips, and you know, this is much smaller than the previous one. But you really do want to be careful here, because the more you thin Corax White, the more it wants to dry really, really quickly. So just make sure that you're constantly re-dipping your brush, that you're staying on top of making sure that that paint is wet and flowing nicely. If you have some kind of flow improver, that's going to do you some big favours. You see me just picking at the end of my brush there, and that's because as it dries it forms a little bead on the end of your brush. So if you just sort of pick at the end of your brush every now and again, you can pull that bead off and the paint will start to flow properly again. You can see I'm just going around and highlighting exactly the same areas I've already highlighted, just smaller, more carefully, further towards tips of things, that kind of stuff. Very straightforward, but I think this slightly more sparing edge highlight looks a lot nicer personally. I think it's a lot more impactful when it's not covering the entire miniature. After all, the point of a highlight, is it not, to create impact, to create pop? There we go, that's how he looks now after 2 stages of edge highlighting. Then we're going to go into Rhinox Hide. This is one of my favourite Citadel paints. I really, really do love this paint. We're going to start painting some battle damage. Shout outs to Darren Latham. This is very, very similar to his method. And interestingly enough, it's the way I've done it for a long time, But when Darren Latham released his tutorial on it, it really helped me kind of mentally process how I was doing it and why I was doing it that way. Which was excellent because it sort of cemented, oh, this is a really good way to do battle damage. Basically, very, very thin paint, right off the last hair of your brush. And I'm going to give you a super zoom here just so you can see what we're putting down. There you go, just some really, really nice, clean, dispersed dots that look fairly random. And now we're going to go into hyperspeed and start to get them all over the rest of the miniature. You'll see every now and again I'll do a little straight line slash instead of a dot, and every now and again I'll do one that's a bit bigger than the others. This is again just to try and improve that idea of randomness, to try and cement that idea that it's organic damage and not paint that's been placed on a toy soldier. Remember, the best painting is selling lies. That's the way I always like to put it. You're trying to convince people that the things that you've put on something with a paintbrush are real things, and you know, not necessarily the best. Maybe these are the right expressions to use, but you get my point. So there we go. There's that brown battle damage in all over our dude. And then we're going to grab some Graveyard Bone now from Reaper. I specifically chose this just because it doesn't have as much of that tip drying issue as Corax White. You could have done this with Corax White if you wanted to, if you don't have another colour. Yushabti Bone from GW would also work. We're basically targeting the bottom of those little dots now. And I'm not going to pretend this isn't difficult, folks. You are aiming for the bottom of something that is as small as most people can really paint. So doing this accurately is tricky. But you're basically trying to create a highlight on these things to make them look more three-dimensional. What I would recommend here is don't try to highlight every single one of them. You can afford for some of them to not be highlighted, and that actually again creates more of a sense of depth and dimension. You know, as if sort of some of them are deep enough to pick up light and some of them are just a little ding on the surface so they don't really pick up a highlight. It's going to save you a lot of time, it's going to save you pulling your hair out because it is tricky to highlight these, and it's also just going to, you know, add something else to the effect, another layer of thought. With Indomitus coming out, we are all going to want some sexy Space Marines, so we do need to be thinking about these kind of things in my mind. Now we're going to jump through just to highlight some blacks here. I'm just using the same greys that are on the power armour, so it's Stormvermin fur for the first highlight, and then Celestra grey for the second one, and then the pinpoint highlights I believe are Corax White. Very optional how far you want to go with this, but again, unlike the traditional sort of GW approach to it, I don't like to highlight every single edge and surface. I think it looks way too much personally. I like to keep it a bit more subtle, I like to keep it a bit more restrained, a bit more tasteful, and I think it gives a much nicer finished product. What you'll also see here is that I do come back in and I tidy these lines up with black. Never feel like you have to hit these lines perfectly first time. Get them in and get the colour transitions looking right. If they're a bit fat, you can just pop in with some black and slim them down, or whatever your base colour is. Also getting a bit of Corax White here just to do the plasma coils. I decided to experiment a bit on the plasma coils here. Used a method that I haven't really used before. It's something I probably will practice a bit more and try and get a bit better at, actually, because I think it's a very good method. I just think this being my first time doing it, I didn't maybe execute it as well as I could have. It still looks good, as you're going to see when we get to it, but I definitely think I can improve on this method more. A bit less airbrush and a bit more paintbrush, I think, will be the secret. But we'll get to that in just a second. This is what we've got at the moment. Beautiful boy. And then to start that, we're going to use some Shyish purple contrast in the airbrush. And I'm just going to do some very, very controlled squirts here, just to try and get a bit of a gradient. So really, really dark purple in the corners and just starting to gradiate out in towards the center of the coil. Probably Shyish purple wasn't the best choice here. It's like a really blacky purple, so it kind of wiped out a lot of that white. I thought it was more translucent than it is, and maybe the answer there was just that I should have thinned it more, and it would have been, but I think it would have probably been better just to start off painting it purple, and then to use some sort of pinks and whites to create highlights. But as you can see here, I'm just painting the sort of area that I want to glow back in, and then we're going to switch to Thuvian Sun Orchid, which is one of the Reaper paints that I use a bloody ton of. We're going to just mix some of that into the Shyish purple, and this is going to give me a bit of a lighter, bit of a more vibrant purple now. Correct a bit of that sort of overly dark purple that we were ending up with. Then switching to a mixture of basically what was in the airbrush, so Shyish purple and Thuvian Sun Orchid, and just adding a touch of white into it and starting to paint in the sort of heavy glow now. This is where I sort of thought maybe it was just not worth using the airbrush in the first place, because the effect doesn't really start to look like much until you paint this glow in anyway. So maybe it would have been better just to kind of hand paint the surrounding area. I've added a bit more white there and taken the glow a bit further now, sort of do a couple of runs of it, getting brighter and brighter. Eventually I did get just some pure Corax White and just put some little minute dots. And then on the back as well. A quick tidy up at the end with some black is important here as well. You really want that light glow to sort of have a hard contrast against it to tell you that it is bright. So just a quick skim across with some black there as well. That's the weapon, looking pretty tidy now. Lovely, lovely. And our completed miniature with some basing, etc. looks a bit like this. I used all fish tank related stuff to base this guy, so that's you know, a bit of a pun there, I suppose. Which is why I then decided to go for this kind of tealy, pinky, grey kind of fish tanky colours for the basing as well. It's a bit odd, but I think it's really cool, and it's, you know, kind of makes me laugh to think about a space shark with a fish tank decorated base. I love this workup though. It's definitely banking this for Indomitus inspiration. Don't know exactly what I'm doing with the Indomitus box set yet, so going to be getting in a lot of inspirational practice. And there you have it! Spaciest of sharks! This little guy, I tell you what, that's one of my favourite miniatures I've painted recently, and it's just a Hellblaster. Like, it's just a normal common garden Hellblaster, and I had such a good time with it. And I'll tell you, the reason I had such a good time with it is just because a simple neutral colour scheme like that just lets you play so much. It lets you, you know, things like the battle damage looks really pronounced and really nice. The brown shading to kind of give it that sort of dirty, more interesting, vibrant look, that looks really cool. Just really my cup of tea, very much my kind of painting. So I hope you enjoyed him, folks. I hope that I will catch you for this week's second video as well. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. You know how important that is. It helps get me seen. I'll see you in the next one, everybody. Thanks for watching.